Have you ever noticed that the strongest minds don't talk much, don't react quickly, and don't seek approval? They stay calm when others panic, silent when others argue, and focused when others break. And strangely, this kind of mental strength often makes people uncomfortable, not because it's loud, but because it's controlled. A strong mind doesn't need to prove itself, and that's exactly why it can feel intimidating. In this video, you'll discover how true mental strength is built, why it changes the way people react to you, and the hidden psychology behind a mind so strong, it quietly scares people. Emotional control is one of the rarest psychological skills, and that is exactly why it feels powerful. Most people live in reaction mode. Their moods shift based on words, looks, tone, and situations outside their control. A single comment can change their energy. A small rejection can ruin their focus. When someone realizes this pattern, they also realize how predictable human behavior becomes. Emotional control breaks that pattern, and when predictability disappears, people feel uneasy. The human brain is wired to look for feedback loops. When someone criticizes, they expect anger. When they provoke, they expect defense. When they insult, they expect insecurity. These expectations give people a sense of control over others. The moment those expectations fail, the brain experiences confusion. That confusion is often interpreted as fear or intimidation. A person who cannot be emotionally moved becomes difficult to read, and anything difficult to read is automatically perceived as a threat. Psychologically, emotional reactions act as signals. They tell others where your limits are, what hurts you, and how you can be influenced. Anger reveals pressure points. Defensiveness reveals insecurity. Over-explaining reveals self-doubt. When emotions spill outward, they become data for other people to use. A person with emotional control gives away very little data. Their responses are minimal, measured, and intentional. This lack of information makes others feel exposed while you remain protected. The strongest emotional control is not emotional suppression. Suppression creates tension and leaks out in other ways. True emotional control comes from awareness. It begins when you notice the emotion without becoming it. Instead of saying, "I am angry," the mind says anger is present. This small shift changes everything. The emotion is no longer driving behavior, it is being observed. Observation slows reaction. Slowness creates space. In that space, choice appears. Most people do not realize how much power they hand over emotionally. They argue to feel heard. They react to feel respected. They defend to protect identity. When someone no longer needs to do these things, it disrupts social dynamics. A calm response in a tense situation silently communicates confidence. A lack of reaction in the face of insult signals inner stability. People are conditioned to believe strength looks loud. When strength shows up as quiet control, it feels unsettling. There is also a neurological component. Emotional reactions are often driven by the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system. When the amygdala takes control, logic weakens and impulsive behavior increases. Emotional control strengthens the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and regulation. Over time, this creates a visible difference in behavior. Responses become slower, words become fewer, and expressions become neutral. Others sense this shift, even if they cannot explain it. People often fear what they cannot manipulate. Emotional individuals are easy to influence because their reactions can be predicted. Praise makes them soft. Criticism makes them unstable. Silence makes them anxious. A person with emotional control does not respond automatically to any of these triggers. Praise does not inflate them. Criticism does not collapse them. Silence does not disturb them. This emotional independence removes leverage, and when leverage disappears, people feel powerless. In social situations, emotional control often gets misinterpreted as arrogance or coldness. In reality, it is self-mastery. The absence of visible emotion forces others to confront their own. When someone lashes out and receives calm in return, the discomfort intensifies. The expected emotional exchange does not happen, so the person is left alone with their own energy. This mirror effect makes people uneasy. They feel exposed without understanding why. Emotional control also changes power dynamics without confrontation. In arguments, the person who reacts first usually loses leverage. Their emotional investment becomes visible. The person who stays calm controls the pace, the tone, and the direction of the interaction. This is why emotionally controlled individuals often appear dominant even when they speak less. Dominance here is not aggression, it is stability. There is a deeper psychological reason this kind of strength scares people. Emotional control signals self-sufficiency. It shows that approval is not needed for balance. Humans are social creatures, and much of social behavior is built around mutual emotional exchange. When one person does not participate in that exchange in predictable ways, it disrupts the unwritten rules of interaction. The brain labels this disruption as danger, even when no threat exists. Over time, emotional control reshapes identity. Instead of being defined by reactions, identity becomes anchored in values and principles. Decisions are no longer made to relieve emotional discomfort, but to align with long-term intent. This creates consistency. Consistency builds presence. Presence commands attention without effort. People feel it immediately when someone is grounded in themselves. This control also creates psychological distance. Not emotional distance, but mental distance. Situations are seen clearly instead of personally. Criticism becomes information, not an attack. Rejection becomes redirection, not humiliation. Conflict becomes a data point, not a threat. This perspective shift reduces internal chaos. When internal chaos disappears, external chaos loses its power. People often assume emotional control means lack of feeling. In reality, it often means deeper feeling. The difference is regulation. Emotions are felt fully but expressed selectively. This selectivity is what creates strength. When emotions are not broadcasted, they retain their power internally. When emotions are constantly released, they lose intensity and direction. A strong mind does not rush to prove anything emotionally. It does not seek to win arguments to feel superior. It does not need validation to feel real. This detachment is not indifference. It is self-trust. And self-trust is unsettling to those who rely on external reassurance. When someone cannot be shaken, influenced, or emotionally cornered, they change the psychological balance of any interaction. This is why emotional control often attracts both respect and resistance. Some people admire it because it reflects what they want to develop. Others resist it because it exposes their own lack of control. The presence of emotional stability highlights emotional instability without saying a word. That silent contrast can feel threatening. In moments of pressure, emotional control becomes most visible. Stress reveals habits. Crisis reveals structure. When chaos enters a room, most people react emotionally. The one who remains calm instantly becomes a reference point. Others unconsciously look to them for cues. Leadership emerges without authority. Influence appears without force. This influence is subtle, but it is deeply felt. Emotional control also protects energy. Reactions consume mental resources. Every emotional outburst drains focus. Every internal argument wastes attention. When emotions are regulated, energy is conserved and redirected. That energy sharpens thinking, improves memory, and strengthens discipline. Over time, this creates a noticeable difference in how a person moves, speaks, and decides. The fear people feel around emotionally controlled individuals is not fear of harm. It is fear of imbalance. They sense that emotional games will not work. Manipulation will fail. Provocation will fall flat. In a world where many rely on emotional leverage, this lack of access creates discomfort. Emotional control does not make life easier. It makes it clearer. Feelings are no longer avoided, but they are no longer obeyed. This clarity allows someone to walk through tension without absorbing it, to hear criticism without becoming it, to face pressure without collapsing under it. When emotional control becomes consistent, it reshapes how others interact with you. Conversations become more careful. Provocations decrease. Disrespect becomes rare, not because of intimidation, but because boundaries are sensed, not announced. People instinctively adjust their behavior around those who cannot be emotionally pushed. This kind of strength is quiet, internal, and invisible until tested. It does not announce itself. It does not seek recognition. But when situations demand reaction and none is given, when chaos demands emotion and receives calm, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Silence has a strange psychological effect on people, especially when it appears where a reaction is expected. Human interaction is built on rhythm. One person speaks, the other responds. One action triggers another. This predictable exchange creates comfort. When that rhythm breaks, the brain immediately starts searching for meaning. Silence interrupts the pattern, and interruption creates tension. Most people use reactions as reassurance. A laugh confirms acceptance. Anger confirms impact. Defense confirms vulnerability. Even disagreement confirms engagement. Silence confirms nothing. And when nothing is confirmed, the mind fills the gap on its own. People begin to wonder what you are thinking, what you are judging, or what you know. The absence of reaction becomes more powerful than any response could have been. Psychologically, silence forces projection. When someone provokes and receives no reaction, they are left alone with their own intent. If the intent was hostile, the discomfort increases. If the intent was manipulative, the strategy collapses. Silence removes feedback, and without feedback, control is lost. This loss of control is what makes silence feel intimidating rather than calm. The human brain dislikes uncertainty. It is wired to predict outcomes in order to feel safe. When you remain silent, you remove predictable outcomes. Others cannot tell if you are offended, amused, indifferent, or calculating. This ambiguity triggers anxiety because the brain cannot categorize the situation. Anything that cannot be categorized is treated as a potential threat. Silence also shifts power dynamics without effort. In conversations, the person who reacts is usually responding from emotion. The person who stays silent controls time and direction. They decide when, if, and how to respond. This control over timing subtly places them in a dominant psychological position, not through force, but through restraint. Many people are uncomfortable with silence because it exposes internal noise. When there is no external reaction to focus on, attention turns inward. Thoughts become louder, doubts surface, insecurities appear. Silence acts like a mirror. It reflects whatever the other person brings into the interaction. If that inner state is unstable, silence amplifies the discomfort. This is why silence is often mistaken for judgment. Even when none exists, people assume it does. The mind fills gaps with fear-based interpretations. A neutral face becomes disapproval. A pause becomes rejection. A lack of response becomes superiority. Silence itself does nothing, but the meanings projected onto it create emotional reactions in others. There is also a social conditioning element. From an early age, people are taught that silence is awkward and must be filled. Speaking becomes a way to maintain control and avoid vulnerability. When someone does not play by this rule, it disrupts the social contract. Others feel exposed because the familiar structure is gone. Silence is especially powerful in moments of conflict. When emotions are high, reactions are expected. Anger expects anger. Accusation expects defense. Insult expects retaliation. Silence in these moments feels unnatural because it does not feed the emotional loop. The emotional energy has nowhere to go, so it turns inward. The person who initiated the conflict begins to feel the weight of their own emotion. Neurologically, silence slows the interaction and engages higher-order thinking. When you do not react immediately, the emotional centers of the brain lose dominance, and the rational centers regain control. This shift changes the quality of the interaction. While others remain emotionally charged, the silent individual remains regulated. That contrast is felt instantly. People often confuse silence with weakness, but only when they have not experienced it directed at them. Once silence is encountered in a moment where reaction was expected, it becomes unsettling. There is no handle to grab, no emotion to pull, no angle to exploit. Silence offers no entry point. Silence also protects information. Reactions reveal priorities. Anger shows what matters. Defense shows where insecurity lies. Excitement shows desire. Silence reveals nothing. In strategic terms, this makes silence one of the most effective forms of self-protection. Others must guess, and guessing always favors the one who knows. Over time, consistent silence changes how people approach you. They speak more carefully. They test less. They hesitate before provoking. not because you have threatened them, but because previous attempts produced no reward. Behavior that brings no result eventually stops. Silence conditions others without confrontation. There is an internal discipline required for this kind of silence. It is not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of control. Avoidant silence comes from fear. Controlled silence comes from awareness. The difference is felt. One feels tense, the other feels grounded. People sense this distinction even if they cannot articulate it. Silence also disrupts manipulation. Manipulation depends on emotional hooks: guilt, urgency, flattery, pressure. When these hooks do not catch, the manipulator feels exposed. Silence refuses to engage with the emotional bait. Without engagement, manipulation collapses. In group settings, silence often draws attention without intention. While others compete for space, the quiet presence stands out. People begin to watch, not because of noise, but because of stillness. Stillness signals self-containment. Self-containment signals confidence. Silence also allows observation. While others speak, you gather information. Tone, timing, body language, inconsistencies. Silence creates a one-way flow of data. You receive without giving. This asymmetry increases awareness and reduces vulnerability. Many people fear silence because it slows time. In slowed time, emotions are felt more fully. Regret surfaces. Intent becomes clearer. Words cannot hide behind momentum. Silence removes distraction and leaves only truth and discomfort. When silence becomes a habit rather than a tactic, it reshapes identity. You no longer feel the urge to explain yourself, defend every choice, or react to every stimulus. Emotional independence grows. With it, psychological distance forms. Situations are seen clearly rather than personally. The intimidation of silence does not come from aggression. It comes from composure. A composed person cannot be rushed. They cannot be cornered emotionally. They cannot be forced into reaction. This removes many common social weapons from others' hands. Silence also communicates boundaries without words. It says certain behaviors will not be rewarded with attention. Over time, people learn where they stand. Respect increases not through assertion, but through consistency. In moments where others seek validation through reaction, silence denies it. This denial is not cruel, but it is firm. It refuses to participate in emotional transactions that do not align with inner standards. Silence makes people aware of their own dependence on reaction. They realize how much of their confidence comes from response, how much of their control comes from emotional influence. Facing someone who does not provide this feedback can feel destabilizing. The power of silence lies in its restraint. It does not escalate. It does not argue. It does not chase understanding. It waits. And in waiting, it shifts the psychological weight of the interaction entirely. A strong mind does not need constant confirmation from others to feel secure. Most people unknowingly outsource their self-worth. They look for approval in reactions, compliments, likes, agreement, or attention. Each external response becomes a signal that tells them who they are allowed to be. When that signal is missing, discomfort appears. When it is withdrawn, insecurity grows. A mind that no longer depends on this system immediately stands apart. Psychologically, validation seeking is a survival habit. Humans evolved in groups where acceptance meant safety. Rejection meant danger. Over time, the brain learned to treat approval as reassurance. But in modern life, this wiring often turns into dependency. People adjust their behavior, opinions, and even identity to maintain approval. This constant adjustment creates mental noise and emotional instability. When someone stops seeking validation, the brain reorganizes its priorities. Decisions are no longer filtered through "how will this look?" or "what will they think?" Instead, they are filtered through internal standards. This shift is subtle but powerful. It creates consistency, and consistency is rare in a world driven by reaction. Others sense this independence immediately. It feels unfamiliar. When people cannot influence your self-image with praise or criticism, they lose leverage. Compliments no longer control you. Disapproval no longer destabilizes you. This emotional neutrality feels unsettling to those who rely on influence to feel significant. A validation-free mind is difficult to read. Emotional responses are measured, not performative. Opinions are expressed without needing agreement. Silence is comfortable. Presence feels grounded rather than needy. People often misinterpret this as arrogance when it is actually self-sufficiency. Social dynamics often revolve around subtle exchanges of validation, laughing at jokes, nodding in agreement, mirroring opinions. These exchanges maintain harmony but also reinforce conformity. When someone opts out, even unintentionally, it disrupts the pattern. Others begin to feel exposed because the usual feedback loop is gone. The absence of validation seeking also removes emotional bargaining. Many interactions are driven by unspoken trades, approval in exchange for compliance, acceptance in exchange for silence. When you no longer participate, these trades fail. People realize they cannot buy your agreement or control your behavior through emotional incentives. This independence creates psychological distance. You become less reactive to praise and less defensive against criticism. Feedback is processed rationally rather than emotionally. Useful information is kept. Noise is discarded. This selective engagement signals maturity and inner stability. People often feel uncomfortable around those who are not emotionally hungry. Emotional hunger makes behavior predictable. Independence makes it unpredictable. Predictability feels safe. Unpredictability feels risky. When others cannot anticipate how you will respond emotionally, they become cautious. A mind that does not seek validation also resists manipulation. Guilt loses its grip. Flattery loses its charm. Pressure loses its urgency. These tools rely on emotional dependence. Without it, they fail quietly. The manipulator senses this loss of influence and often withdraws. Internally, this shift brings calm. Thoughts slow down. Self-doubt weakens. The need to explain yourself fades. Energy once spent monitoring reactions is redirected inward. Focus improves. Confidence becomes steady rather than situational. Many people confuse confidence with loudness. In reality, loudness often hides insecurity. True confidence is quiet because it does not need reinforcement. It exists regardless of attention. This quiet confidence feels intimidating because it cannot be competed with or undermined easily. When approval no longer defines you, criticism loses its sting. Not because criticism is ignored, but because it is evaluated objectively. If it aligns with your values, it is useful. If it does not, it is irrelevant. This discernment protects emotional balance. The social cost of this independence is subtle but real. Some people pull away because they feel unnecessary. Others project negative traits to justify their discomfort. Labels like cold, distant, or intimidating often appear. These labels say more about the observer than the observed. Over time, people adjust. Those who value authenticity grow closer. Those who rely on emotional leverage drift away. Relationships become fewer but clearer. Interaction becomes cleaner, less charged, more honest. A validation-free mind also reduces internal conflict. When actions align with values rather than approval, regret decreases. Decisions feel owned. Mistakes become lessons instead of identity threats. The mind feels integrated rather than fragmented. This state is not achieved through isolation, but through self-trust. Trust in one's judgment. Trust in one's ability to handle disapproval. Trust in one's worth without applause. This trust builds slowly through repeated self-alignment. Others often feel challenged by this presence. It reminds them of their own dependence on approval. This reminder can create tension. Instead of self-reflection, many choose discomfort. They sense that you are not playing the same game, and they do not know how to respond. The lack of validation seeking also changes communication. Words are chosen carefully, not to impress, but to express. Silence is allowed. Disagreement is calm. Boundaries are maintained without apology. This clarity feels firm rather than aggressive. A strong mind does not reject connection. It simply refuses to base identity on reaction. Connection becomes choice rather than need. When connection is chosen freely, it carries more weight. People often fear that not seeking validation will lead to loneliness. In reality, it leads to alignment. The right interactions deepen, the wrong ones fade. Emotional energy is conserved instead of scattered. When you no longer chase approval, you stop shrinking yourself to fit expectations. You stop performing versions of yourself that feel acceptable. You occupy space naturally. This natural presence often feels larger than effortful dominance. Those who are used to controlling others through emotional feedback feel unsettled. They sense they no longer hold influence. This loss of influence is often interpreted as threat. A mind that stands on its own does not need to announce its strength. It shows through composure, restraint, and self-direction. Others notice the absence of need before they notice the presence of power. In a world driven by reaction, choosing self-validation changes the entire psychological equation. The moment approval stops being your fuel, external control weakens, internal authority grows, and your presence begins to alter the emotional temperature of every room you enter. Discipline creates patterns, and patterns shape perception. When your behavior follows a consistent internal rule instead of emotional impulse, it becomes difficult for others to predict you. Most people operate on mood, motivation, or immediate reward. Their actions change with how they feel. This predictability makes them easy to read, easy to influence, and easy to anticipate. A disciplined mind does not depend on motivation. It functions on decision. This alone separates it from the majority. Motivation rises and falls. Discipline stays. When people notice that your behavior does not fluctuate with praise, stress, boredom, or pressure, it disrupts their assumptions. They expect emotional variation. They expect reaction. When none appears, confusion replaces certainty. Consistency signals self-command. When you show up the same way regardless of circumstances, others sense that something internal is governing you. This internal authority feels solid. It cannot be negotiated with emotion. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be pulled off course easily. That stability creates a quiet form of unpredictability. Unpredictability does not mean chaos. It means your actions are not driven by external cues. Others cannot trigger you into predictable responses. Praise does not guarantee compliance. Criticism does not guarantee withdrawal. Pressure does not guarantee concession. Because your behavior is guided by principle rather than stimulus, others lose the ability to forecast your reactions. Psychologically, humans rely on prediction to feel safe. The brain constantly anticipates outcomes in social interactions. When those predictions fail, discomfort arises. A disciplined person violates these predictions simply by remaining consistent. The mind expects deviation under stress. When deviation does not occur, it creates cognitive dissonance. Most social influence relies on exploiting inconsistency. People wait for weakness, fatigue, emotion, or urgency to gain leverage. Discipline removes these windows. When your standards do not bend with circumstance, influence attempts fail quietly. This failure often goes unnoticed consciously, but is felt intuitively. Consistency also removes emotional tells. Inconsistent behavior leaks internal states. Frustration shows through impatience. Insecurity shows through over-explanation. Excitement shows through impulsivity. Discipline smooths these fluctuations. Emotional information becomes harder to extract. Others sense this lack of access and feel unsettled. A disciplined mind creates reliability in action, but unpredictability in reaction. Others may know you will act according to your values, but they cannot use emotional pressure to alter those actions. This combination is rare. Reliability usually comes with predictability. Discipline breaks this link. Over time, people adjust their approach. They stop testing boundaries. They stop expecting emotional leverage. They begin to speak more carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for the unknown variable you represent. You are consistent, but not controllable. Discipline also changes time perception. You are not rushed by urgency. You do not sacrifice long-term direction for short-term relief. This patience creates strategic distance. While others react in the moment, you operate across longer horizons. This temporal advantage makes interactions feel unbalanced. In group dynamics, disciplined individuals often become anchors. Others subconsciously reference them for stability. Yet at the same time, they are not easily influenced by group emotion. This resistance creates contrast. Contrast draws attention. Attention creates presence. Many people mistake discipline for rigidity. In reality, true discipline allows flexibility within boundaries. The boundaries do not move, but the path within them can. This distinction is difficult to read from the outside. Others cannot tell whether you will adapt or hold firm because adaptation is internal, not reactive. This ambiguity increases psychological weight. When people cannot predict whether pressure will work, they hesitate to apply it. When hesitation enters the interaction, power shifts, not through dominance but through restraint. Discipline also trains delayed response. Immediate reaction is replaced by pause. The pause creates space. In that space, emotional impulses fade and clarity emerges. Others often mistake this pause for calculation or judgment. In reality, it is regulation. A regulated response feels cold to those who rely on emotional escalation. Escalation seeks reaction. Discipline refuses escalation. The emotional energy returns to its source. This return often feels uncomfortable. The disciplined mind is also difficult to exhaust. Emotional volatility drains energy. Consistency conserves it. Others tire from emotional cycles. The disciplined individual remains steady. Endurance becomes another unpredictable factor. People often fear what they cannot move. A disciplined person feels anchored. They do not sway easily. Attempts to push are met with stillness. Stillness resists force without opposing it. This resistance is subtle but effective. Consistency over time builds reputation. Not the reputation of loud strength, but of quiet reliability. People know you will not act impulsively. They know you will not break under pressure. They know emotional tactics will fail. This knowledge alters how they engage with you. Discipline also limits access. Not everyone earns your time, energy, or explanation. This selectivity is not intentional intimidation, but it is perceived as such. Scarcity increases value. Predictable availability decreases it. When your actions align with your rules rather than others' expectations, confusion often follows. People expect negotiation. They expect exceptions. Discipline removes both. Rules apply regardless of who is present. This fairness feels firm, sometimes harsh, but always clear. A disciplined mind does not chase approval or avoid disapproval. It moves forward regardless. This forward motion creates psychological momentum. Others feel left behind or uncertain how to keep up. The unpredictability created by discipline is not about surprise. It is about independence. Others cannot script your behavior because they are not the author. You are. In environments filled with emotional reactivity, discipline stands out sharply. It exposes inconsistency in others without accusation. The contrast alone is enough to create tension. People often describe disciplined individuals as intimidating without knowing why. What they feel is the absence of leverage. There is nothing to grab, nothing to pull, nothing to rush. A disciplined mind quietly controls its own movement, pace, and direction. In a world driven by impulse, this control feels rare. Rare things attract attention, and attention mixed with uncertainty often feels like fear. A strong mind does not feel the need to explain itself to everyone it encounters. Most people are trapped in a cycle of explanation and justification, constantly clarifying decisions, defending opinions, or proving their intentions. Every interaction becomes a negotiation of perception. This need to explain comes from a fear that others will misinterpret, judge, or reject them. Over time, it creates exhaustion, mental noise, and vulnerability, because each explanation gives away information that can be used to manipulate, influence, or pressure. When someone stops explaining themselves, they reclaim their mental autonomy. Choices are made based on internal standards rather than external validation. Actions no longer require commentary. Decisions are executed without the need to preempt judgment. This refusal to over-explain alters social dynamics because it removes predictable patterns that others rely on. People are accustomed to using words as levers to shape perception. When the lever is gone, influence diminishes. Psychologically, explaining oneself excessively is a form of cognitive surrender. It signals insecurity and dependency on others for self-definition. Every justification provides insight into priorities, values, and fears. The more one explains, the more data is given away. A mind that refrains from explanation maintains strategic opacity. By keeping inner reasoning private, the individual becomes less readable and therefore less manipulable. The discomfort others feel when you stop explaining yourself is rooted in expectation. Humans are conditioned to believe that communication must follow a predictable pattern: action, reaction, clarification, and agreement. Silence or restraint interrupts this rhythm. When your actions exist independently of commentary, others experience uncertainty. They cannot measure your thoughts, predict your next move, or anticipate your emotions. That uncertainty subtly conveys strength. Not explaining yourself does not equate to arrogance or hostility. It is a deliberate choice to conserve energy and maintain psychological integrity. Words are expensive in terms of emotional currency. When spent indiscriminately, they create exposure. When measured, they preserve autonomy. People sense this preservation. It feels mysterious, sometimes intimidating, because the usual emotional tools fail to elicit response. Requests for reassurance, attempts at persuasion, or challenges to authority often fall flat. Consistency in not explaining oneself creates boundaries without confrontation. Boundaries usually require articulation, yet here they exist in action alone. Others learn through experience rather than declaration what is acceptable or influential. This passive signaling is powerful because it operates beneath conscious awareness. Influence is not asserted. It is naturally limited by inaccessibility. The strongest minds choose what to share and with whom. Communication becomes selective. Information is only released when it serves purpose or aligns with values. In doing so, attention is directed, energy conserved, and influence maintained. Selectivity also increases perceived authority. People are drawn to the rare availability of insight or explanation, sensing that when it appears, it carries weight. A refusal to explain oneself also protects emotional energy. Constantly defending choices engages the emotional centers of the brain and strengthens external dependence. When explanations are withheld, energy is redirected toward thought, planning, and reflection. This conservation strengthens focus and sharpens decision-making capabilities. It also reinforces inner stability, which becomes visible to others as a form of quiet power. People are often unsettled when someone does not explain themselves because it disrupts control. Manipulation, persuasion, and social engineering depend on access to reasoning, intentions, and vulnerabilities. When that access is denied, their usual influence fails. This failure is rarely understood consciously, but is immediately felt. The inability to predict or influence another person creates tension, subtle fear, and at times, admiration. Withholding explanation also enhances self-respect. When one no longer feels compelled to justify choices to placate, impress, or appease, self-perception becomes independent of external judgment. This independence increases confidence, allowing decisions to be made swiftly and assertively. Confidence, in turn, subtly commands attention and alters how interactions unfold. Others sense that your mental space is not theirs to occupy casually. In social and professional environments, refraining from over-explanation can recalibrate dynamics. Colleagues, friends, and even strangers begin to interact with a heightened awareness of boundaries. They recognize that influence must be earned rather than demanded, that persuasion will not come through superficial pressure. This recalibration fosters respect, often mixed with a quiet sense of intimidation. Because conventional tactics of control no longer work. The psychological mechanism behind this intimidation is simple: unpredictability combined with composure. When someone does not explain themselves, their behavior is less transparent, and transparency is what others use to anticipate, predict, and manipulate. Deprived of predictable cues, the mind of the observer becomes uncertain. Humans are uncomfortable with uncertainty, particularly when it pertains to social hierarchies, emotional influence, or perceived dominance. A mind that avoids unnecessary explanations also gains clarity. Thought processes are less fragmented because they are not constantly adapted to meet perceived expectations. Decisions are evaluated internally based on logic, principle, or purpose rather than external reactions. This internal alignment fosters decisiveness, reduces hesitation, and strengthens personal authority. Others often notice the resulting clarity, which can feel overwhelming if they are used to influencing your decisions through conversation. Refusing to over-explain also reduces conflict. Many disagreements are prolonged not because of genuine misunderstanding, but because one party attempts to secure agreement through explanation. By removing unnecessary commentary, conversations become leaner and more purposeful. Interactions are dictated by reality and observation rather than emotional exchange. This economy of communication creates both efficiency and psychological weight. This approach encourages observation over reaction. When you do not feel compelled to justify yourself, you have the mental bandwidth to study the environment, assess intentions, and anticipate outcomes. This observational advantage becomes a subtle form of leverage. Others may feel watched or measured, even if the observation is silent. Awareness alone can exert influence without a single word being spoken. Another benefit lies in emotional regulation. When explanations are withheld, emotional impulses are less likely to dictate behavior. Anger, defensiveness, embarrassment, or excitement are observed and controlled rather than expressed immediately. This self-regulation reinforces perception of stability, reliability, and strength, qualities that often intimidate those accustomed to triggering reactive responses. Over time, the practice of not explaining oneself shapes identity. Self-definition becomes internal rather than social. Values, intentions, and decisions are anchored to personal standards instead of external validation. This internal foundation provides resilience. Challenges, criticism, and misunderstanding no longer erode confidence. The mind develops a quiet, consistent strength that radiates without effort. The social impact of this strength is significant. People often underestimate the power of silence and selective communication. When an individual does not over-explain, they shift the dynamics of interaction. Conversations are no longer guided by expectation, but by observation. The inability to predict response generates curiosity, caution, and respect. These reactions are often interpreted as intimidation, though they stem from competence and composure rather than aggression. Small talk is one of the most misunderstood aspects of social interaction, especially for people with strong, introspective minds. Most individuals treat conversation as a casual exchange of words, a ritual to maintain connection, or a way to fill silence. To those whose brains are wired for depth and pattern recognition, these interactions often feel tedious, exhausting, and mentally draining. The reason is not social anxiety or disinterest. It is the brain's need for meaningful patterns, insight, and substance, which small talk rarely provides. At a neurological level, introverted or deeply reflective minds operate differently when processing social input. While extroverts may receive a dopamine boost from mere engagement or interaction, deeper thinkers require cognitive reward from meaningful content. Small talk rarely delivers that reward. Instead, it activates the brain's pattern-seeking systems, searching for relevance, hidden meaning, or connection where there is little to find. This creates a paradox. Outwardly passive or simple conversation requires intense internal effort, leading to fatigue without the emotional payoff others experience. The human brain is constantly scanning for patterns in both environment and social interaction. When conversation lacks depth, the pattern-seeking function struggles to find significance. Each trivial topic, the weather, a colleague's weekend, superficial compliments, triggers a subtle cognitive alert. Is this meaningful? Why is this happening? Is there something to notice? For minds attuned to nuance, this internal scanning consumes energy at a level that casual participants rarely perceive. Mental effort is expended not on conversation itself, but on the unconscious search for insight. Emotional and social sensitivity compounds the effect. People who are highly observant notice microexpressions, inconsistencies in tone, gestures, and subtleties of interaction that most overlook. In small talk, these cues rarely provide actionable information, yet the brain continues to process them. A simple exchange of pleasantries can feel like a complex puzzle to decode, even when the outward behavior appears calm. This heightened perception is both a gift and a source of fatigue. Small talk also demands performance in subtle ways. Social norms and etiquette encourage polite engagement, humor, and responsive behavior, even when the mind is disinterested. This performance requires suppressing internal commentary, evaluating word choice, and calibrating tone, all while the brain continues to seek depth and significance. The cognitive load accumulates quickly. While an extrovert might gain energy from these exchanges, a deeply introspective person expends mental resources with little reward, leading to exhaustion. Another psychological factor is control over the environment. Small talk often involves unpredictable elements, unexpected questions, unplanned topics, and social pressures to maintain rapport. For minds that thrive on structure and predictability, this unpredictability is taxing. Each conversational turn requires rapid evaluation. What is relevant? How should I respond? What does this mean about the other person? This constant monitoring amplifies cognitive strain and emotional fatigue, even in settings that seem casual or familiar. The reward system in the brain plays a key role in why small talk feels draining. Social interactions typically activate dopamine pathways, producing feelings of pleasure and reinforcement. Extroverts receive dopamine from interaction itself, regardless of content. Deep thinkers, however, rely on cognitive engagement as the trigger for reward. Without meaningful insight, storytelling, problem-solving, or pattern recognition, the dopamine boost is minimal or absent. The result is mental exertion without satisfaction, creating a sense of social fatigue rather than pleasure. Silence and reflection are often more productive for minds that crave meaning. While small talk fills gaps in conversation, reflection fills gaps in understanding. Introverted or deeply analytical individuals often prefer mental processing over verbal expression in these moments. Thoughts are observed, categorized, and connected internally, creating rich cognitive frameworks. Socially, these moments of quiet may appear inactive, but internally, the mind is highly active and engaged, strengthening comprehension, planning, and insight. Small talk can also heighten awareness of emotional dynamics, which contributes to mental load. Each superficial statement, joke, or observation carries potential social meaning, hierarchy, approval, judgment, or subtle intent. Even when topics are trivial, the brain scans for hidden signals, assessing relationships and power structures. This constant evaluation requires energy, particularly when interaction is perceived as obligatory or socially mandated. The effort involved is rarely visible, but significantly impacts mental stamina. Fatigue from small talk is compounded by the need to respond appropriately, even when internal energy is depleted. Conversation requires attentional focus, memory recall, and social judgment simultaneously. A single misstep can disrupt social perception, leading to increased monitoring and caution. Minds attuned to detail often double-check responses, adjust tone, and anticipate reactions while still scanning for pattern or meaning. The result is layered cognitive load, responding, observing, and analyzing all at once. Interestingly, this cognitive strain can be reframed as an advantage. Minds that process beyond surface-level content develop heightened perception, nuanced judgment, and the ability to detect authenticity in others. While small talk is draining, it provides subtle training in attention, observation, and social inference. Over time, the brain becomes skilled at detecting what is meaningful beneath superficial chatter, giving individuals an edge in more consequential interactions. Small talk can also create internal tension when energy conservation conflicts with social expectation. Society often pressures individuals to participate in casual interaction for politeness, networking, or relationship maintenance. Deep thinkers face a choice: expend energy on trivial exchange or risk social discomfort. This tension creates mental stress, as the brain balances internal needs with external pressures. The internal resistance adds to perceived exhaustion, even when conversation is brief or polite. Neuroscience suggests that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision-making and evaluation, works overtime in these scenarios. It regulates responses, filters irrelevant information, and manages social strategy. The constant engagement of higher-order cognitive functions explains why small talk, seemingly effortless for others, feels like mental labor. Over time, repeated low-reward social interactions can result in subtle cognitive fatigue, highlighting the importance of selective engagement. Another layer is emotional regulation. Maintaining composure while processing an unstructured, low-value conversation requires suppressing natural impulses to react, joke, or disengage. Emotional suppression, while brief, adds to cognitive load and can leave the mind feeling depleted. Unlike engaged, meaningful dialogue, where emotional expression aligns with cognitive processing, small talk often forces a mismatch, intensifying fatigue. Ultimately, small talk feels exhausting because it demands a level of cognitive effort disproportionate to the stimulus it provides. The mind is searching for relevance, patterns, and meaning where none are readily available. Observation, attention to subtle cues, emotional regulation, and social performance all require energy without providing adequate reward. The mismatch between effort and stimulation creates the sense of mental drain that is so familiar to introspective individuals. Even brief interactions accumulate over time, magnifying the effect. Each small conversation requires mental scanning, interpretation, and subtle adjustment. Without the reward of insight or stimulation, the cumulative impact becomes noticeable, contributing to social fatigue. This phenomenon explains why deeply reflective individuals may prefer solitude or meaningful exchanges over extended periods of casual interaction. Deep thinkers often use strategies to mitigate this fatigue, such as selective engagement, setting boundaries, or redirecting conversations toward topics of significance. These strategies conserve cognitive resources while still maintaining social presence. By prioritizing meaningful interaction, the mind receives reward and stimulation commensurate with its processing needs, reducing exhaustion and reinforcing internal patterns of observation and reflection. Alone time is often misunderstood as avoidance, weakness, or social deficiency. But for minds that are naturally introspective or deeply analytical, solitude serves a profoundly different purpose. While society often emphasizes constant interaction, activity, and external engagement, the solitary mind is engaged in a parallel process: the construction of insight, creativity, and self-mastery. Alone time is not emptiness. It is mental space for connection with the self, reflection on experience, and the formation of new ideas. The brain requires periods of rest from external stimulation to process complex information. During interactions, attention is divided between observation, response, and analysis of social cues. Solitude allows the mind to release this divided attention and reallocate cognitive resources toward internal organization. Thoughts that are scattered in social environments can be sorted, patterns recognized, and new connections formed. This internal processing is often invisible to others, but it is foundational for mental strength, problem-solving, and creativity. Creativity flourishes in the absence of distraction. Many of the world's great thinkers, artists, and leaders have relied on periods of intentional solitude to allow ideas to emerge naturally. When the mind is alone, it is free to wander across mental landscapes, linking concepts, exploring hypothetical scenarios, and imagining possibilities that would be drowned out by constant external noise. This cognitive freedom enhances not only creativity, but also problem-solving capacity, allowing solutions to surface without the pressure of immediate social feedback. Alone time also allows for deep emotional integration. Daily life imposes emotional stimuli from interactions, expectations, and social norms. Each encounter generates impressions, reactions, and minor stresses. When alone, the mind can process these emotional inputs without interference, understand their origins, and integrate them into a coherent internal framework. This process strengthens emotional intelligence, resilience, and self-awareness, qualities that are often mistaken by others for aloofness or detachment. Another critical function of solitude is reflection on personal values, goals, and priorities. Without external pressure or distraction, the mind evaluates life decisions in alignment with internal principles rather than social expectations. This reflective process encourages authenticity, as choices are made based on self-determined standards rather than reactive conformity. The clarity gained from such reflection is often intimidating to others, because it represents self-sufficiency and resistance to manipulation. During alone time, the mind also rehearses future scenarios and explores potential outcomes. Humans are natural pattern seekers, and in solitude, the brain can simulate social, professional, or creative challenges without the immediate consequences of real-world testing. This mental rehearsal enhances preparedness, strategic thinking, and confidence. While it may appear as inactivity from the outside, internally the mind is actively strengthening capabilities, anticipating obstacles, and designing optimal responses. Solitude cultivates mental discipline. Without external engagement dictating attention, the mind learns to focus intentionally. Tasks, thoughts, and reflections are chosen deliberately rather than being imposed by social circumstance. This discipline translates to sharper concentration, improved memory, and the ability to pursue long-term objectives with persistence. It also reduces susceptibility to distraction and external influence, strengthening the mind's independence. Emotional regulation is another benefit of solitary periods. When alone, the mind can observe emotions as they arise without reacting impulsively. Anger, frustration, or anxiety can be acknowledged, analyzed, and processed internally, preventing reactive behaviors that may compromise composure or decision-making in social contexts. This practice reinforces self-control, a trait often perceived by others as quiet strength or intimidation. Alone time also allows for the refinement of perspective. In the absence of social echo chambers or groupthink, the mind evaluates situations, beliefs, and external information critically. This autonomous assessment encourages independent thought, self-reliance, and clarity of judgment. People who spend significant time reflecting alone often develop a nuanced understanding of the world and the behavior of others, which can be difficult to challenge or influence. For highly sensitive or perceptive minds, solitude functions as a form of recharging. Social interaction, especially in high-stimulation environments, consumes cognitive and emotional energy. Time spent alone replenishes reserves, allowing the brain to recover from mental fatigue. During these periods, neural pathways involved in complex thinking, emotional processing, and long-term planning remain active without the interference of external demands, enhancing efficiency and effectiveness once social engagement resumes. The mind in solitude often uncovers insights that remain hidden in group settings. Without the noise of opinion, judgment, and expectation, subtle connections between experiences, observations, and knowledge emerge naturally. These realizations contribute to wisdom, creativity, and problem-solving ability. In essence, alone time transforms passive mental activity into active cognitive growth, building capacities that remain invisible to others until demonstrated through action. Self-reflection in solitude also strengthens self-trust. Decisions made in private, tested internally, and followed through without reliance on external validation reinforce confidence. The more the mind exercises independent judgment, the less it requires reassurance from others. This internal reliability creates a presence that can be subtly intimidating, as others sense stability and unshakable self-assurance without being able to influence it. Solitude enhances learning and memory as well. Without constant interruptions, the brain can consolidate experiences and knowledge more effectively. Neural connections are strengthened, insights are stored, and complex patterns are recognized. The uninterrupted mental processing that occurs during alone time builds a foundation of cognitive resilience and intellectual flexibility. Furthermore, solitude allows for the cultivation of internal creativity that is free from critique or expectation. In social settings, ideas may be unconsciously censored or modified to fit perceived norms. Alone, the mind can experiment, explore unconventional thoughts, and engage with ideas without fear of judgment. This unrestricted exploration contributes to innovative thinking and enhances problem-solving skills that later translate into social and professional contexts. Finally, alone time encourages self-compassion and self-understanding. Without the influence of external comparison, judgment, or competition, the mind can evaluate personal strengths and weaknesses objectively. This practice fosters mental resilience, reduces anxiety, and strengthens the foundation for personal growth. Over time, these periods of solitude produce a mind that is disciplined, perceptive, creative, and emotionally balanced, capable of navigating the world with clarity and purpose. Detachment from outcomes is one of the most misunderstood aspects of mental strength. Most people operate as if their value, happiness, or sense of control depends entirely on the results of their actions. Promotions, praise, recognition, approval, and success are treated as guarantees for self-worth. When outcomes do not align with expectations, emotional instability, frustration, or self-doubt often follow. The mind that practices detachment learns to separate effort from result, process from reward, and action from validation, creating a level of resilience that feels almost untouchable to others. Psychologically, the attachment to outcomes is rooted in conditioning. From childhood, humans are trained to link achievement with approval. Rewards reinforce behavior, and failures reinforce fear. This creates an emotional dependency on results. Over time, people invest energy not just in their actions, but in predicting, controlling, and fearing the consequences. Detachment from outcomes interrupts this cycle, allowing focus to remain on effort, skill, and principle rather than on external confirmation. When a person practices detachment, they develop clarity of intention. Actions are guided by values, goals, and strategy rather than by the fear of what others will think or what might happen. This internal compass frees the mind from distraction and pressure. Decisions are executed for their inherent purpose and not for the promise of reward. This shift in perspective produces calm, quiet confidence because the mind is anchored in control of the controllable, the action itself, rather than the unpredictable result. Others sense this mental independence immediately. People are accustomed to manipulating outcomes to influence emotion, perception, or behavior. When someone operates without attachment, the usual levers of influence fail. Praise does not elevate them. Criticism does not destabilize them. Threats and pressure lose effectiveness. This refusal to be swayed makes others uneasy because they are confronted with a presence that is not easily controlled, predicted, or provoked. Detachment also changes the way risk is perceived. Most individuals avoid risk because of the fear of negative outcomes, failure, or judgment. A detached mind, however, evaluates risk rationally rather than emotionally. The possibility of loss is acknowledged but does not dominate thought. Decisions are made based on logic, principle, and probability rather than on anxiety about the end result. This approach allows for bolder, more strategic actions that others may perceive as fearless or intimidating. The neurological mechanism behind detachment involves balancing the emotional centers of the brain with higher cognitive functions. When the amygdala reacts to potential failure, stress, or criticism, emotional responses can override reason. Practicing detachment strengthens the prefrontal cortex, allowing rational thought to guide action regardless of emotional impulses. This neurological balance results in a composed, steady presence that others instinctively recognize as strength. Detachment also cultivates perseverance. When effort is valued over outcome, individuals continue to act with consistency, even when immediate rewards are absent. Persistence becomes a habit, rooted in principle rather than desire. This continuous forward motion, unaffected by temporary setbacks or external opinion, builds competence, credibility, and quiet authority that is often perceived as intimidating by those who rely on emotional or result-based leverage. In social dynamics, detachment can create discomfort for observers who are outcome-dependent. People often equate effort and success with control over others' perception. When someone operates without concern for recognition or judgment, it undermines the usual social contracts. Attempts to provoke, manipulate, or impress are neutralized by calm indifference. This neutral response exposes emotional dependencies and can create subtle psychological tension. Detachment also enhances emotional regulation. When the mind is not invested in a particular result, it becomes easier to process challenges, criticism, or unexpected outcomes without reactivity. Frustration, anxiety, and disappointment are acknowledged but do not dominate behavior. This equilibrium allows the individual to navigate complex situations with composure, making decisions from clarity rather than from emotional impulse. Another aspect of detachment is the ability to learn from failure without being defined by it. Most people experience self-doubt or shame when outcomes are unfavorable. Detached individuals extract lessons without internalizing judgment. Mistakes are data points for improvement rather than evidence of inadequacy. This perspective fosters rapid learning, adaptive strategy, and long-term resilience that others find difficult to emulate or understand. Detachment does not mean apathy. On the contrary, it often leads to deeper engagement in meaningful actions because attention is focused entirely on the quality of effort rather than the distraction of expectation. Energy that would otherwise be spent worrying, seeking reassurance, or controlling perception is instead invested in deliberate action, planning, and execution. The result is efficiency, mastery, and consistent performance that is quietly powerful. People who practice detachment also develop patience. Outcomes are rarely immediate, and the mind that is invested in results experiences constant urgency. Detachment allows for temporal flexibility, the understanding that effort today may bear fruit tomorrow, or that control over timing is limited. This patience is perceived as confidence and self-possession because it signals that the individual is not pressured or manipulated by short-term events. Detachment shifts internal measurement from external validation to self-reference standards. Progress is tracked against personal benchmarks rather than public opinion. Success is defined by alignment with intention, effort, and principle, not by applause or recognition. This self-referenced metric fosters consistency, focus, and independence, qualities that are often intimidating to those whose sense of worth relies on comparison or approval. In competitive environments, detachment creates psychological leverage. Competitors, colleagues, or adversaries often rely on outcome-based pressure to elicit mistakes or compliance. A detached individual remains unflustered, their mental energy intact, and their judgment unimpaired. The lack of visible emotional reaction disrupts the psychological tactics others employ, creating subtle tension and respect that may be interpreted as intimidation. Finally, detachment fosters resilience. Life is inherently unpredictable, and attachment to results amplifies emotional volatility. By separating effort from outcome, the mind is prepared to absorb uncertainty without destabilization. This mental stability not only protects against stress, but also enhances adaptability, focus, and decision-making under pressure, creating a presence that is both quietly formidable and psychologically commanding. Strategic observation is one of the least understood, yet most powerful tools of a strong mind. While most people engage in conversation to express, persuade, or react, individuals with highly developed mental acuity often observe first, speak second. This approach shifts the focus from performance to perception, allowing the mind to gather nuanced information about people, environments, and dynamics before committing to action. Observation becomes a silent form of influence, shaping interactions without visible effort and often leaving others unaware of its impact. Observation begins with attention to detail. Humans constantly communicate through subtle cues beyond words: tone, timing, facial expressions, body language, micro-movements, and even pauses. Many people overlook these signals, focusing on surface-level dialogue instead. A mind trained in strategic observation notices these subtleties and interprets them to understand intention, mood, and priority. By accurately reading these signals, the observer gains an informational advantage that others cannot easily counter. The psychological effect of being observed is profound. When individuals sense scrutiny, they adjust behavior, sometimes unconsciously. People reveal more of their patterns, inconsistencies, and vulnerabilities under careful observation. This makes the observer more informed and grants an edge in negotiations, social interactions, and decision-making. Observation does not require intervention. Mere attention alters behavior in subtle, predictable ways. Observation also cultivates patience. Most interactions provoke immediate responses, whether emotional, reactive, or impulsive. Observers who withhold reaction create space for information to accumulate. By allowing others to reveal themselves fully, a detached mind can make more informed assessments and plan strategic responses. This patience often feels uncomfortable to others, who are accustomed to eliciting immediate engagement or reaction. A critical element of strategic observation is the suspension of judgment. To truly understand, the mind must focus on facts and behavior rather than subjective interpretation. Jumping to conclusions prematurely limits the informational value of what is being observed. By maintaining objectivity, a strong mind can detect patterns and anomalies without the distortion of bias, increasing both accuracy and clarity. Observation also sharpens empathy and social intuition. By attending closely to subtle emotional cues, the observer develops insight into others, motivations, desires, and vulnerabilities. This does not imply manipulation, but it does enhance strategic awareness. Understanding how others think and feel allows for calculated responses that maximize effectiveness while minimizing unnecessary conflict. The depth of insight gained from observation is often invisible to those being observed, which amplifies its quiet influence. A highly observant mind also cultivates timing. By waiting for the optimal moment to act or speak, influence is maximized. Early or impulsive engagement can reveal intent prematurely or provoke defensiveness. Observation allows one to identify patterns in others, behavior, and select moments when intervention will have the greatest impact. This timing, derived from careful study, is a subtle form of control that often feels intimidating to those unaware of its underlying mechanics. Observation enhances learning and adaptability. Every social interaction is a dataset. Each gesture, word, or reaction provides insight into behavior, expectation, and strategy. By observing without immediate engagement, the mind can analyze trends, anticipate actions, and adjust tactics for future scenarios. This continuous learning loop strengthens foresight, situational awareness, and decision-making capacity. Over time, it creates a mental landscape rich with context and predictive power. One of the most subtle advantages of observation is the ability to influence indirectly. When someone is observed without confrontation or commentary, their own awareness of being watched often prompts self-regulation. Behavior adjusts to match perceived expectations or standards, revealing priorities, insecurities, and intentions. The observer shapes outcomes not by action, but through presence, awareness, and perception, achieving results without overt exertion of effort or authority. Observation also builds emotional resilience. By focusing externally on cues and patterns rather than internal reactions, the mind avoids being swept into unnecessary emotional cycles. Stress, provocation, or manipulation lose potency because the observer's attention is on understanding rather than reacting. This emotional neutrality reinforces stability, enhances composure, and creates a sense of quiet dominance that others perceive even if it is unintentional. Strategic observation extends to environmental awareness as well. Beyond people, attentive minds read the context, spatial dynamics, timing, and situational cues. Recognizing patterns in environments allows for strategic positioning, anticipation of events, and effective resource management. In complex social or professional settings, this awareness can be a decisive advantage, as it enables preemptive action based on subtle signals rather than overt instructions. The skill of observation requires discipline. It is not passive starring, but active cognitive engagement. The mind filters relevant from irrelevant information, notes deviations from norms, and identifies consistencies. Observation demands sustained attention, mental cataloging, and the ability to suppress the urge for immediate reaction. This discipline ensures that the insights gained are accurate, actionable, and strategically useful. Observation also amplifies psychological influence through contrast. When others are reactive, impulsive, or emotionally driven, the calm, attentive observer stands out. The contrast between their composed presence and the instability around them creates perceived authority. People may not understand why the observer seems powerful, but the combination of silence, attention, and understanding projects strength effortlessly. An observant mind also fosters humility and patience in social judgment. By witnessing actions, intentions, and consequences before forming opinions, the observer avoids premature conclusions. This reduces conflict, enhances credibility, and increases the psychological weight of interventions when they occur. The ability to act with precision and foresight is often interpreted as intelligence, control, or quiet intimidation. Finally, strategic observation builds long-term advantage. Each interaction contributes to a growing internal database of human behavior, patterns, and social dynamics. This cumulative knowledge allows for predictive insight, stronger negotiation skills, and greater resilience under pressure. The mind that observes consistently develops a subtle form of influence that others cannot counter because it operates beneath conscious awareness, guiding perception and action without overt display of force, dominance, or control. Mastery over emotion is one of the most powerful yet invisible aspects of mental strength. Most people are ruled by impulses, reactions, and external triggers, often unaware of how much their emotional state dictates decisions, communication, and behavior. Strong minds recognize that emotion is not the enemy, but a tool that can be observed, managed, and directed. By controlling internal responses without suppressing them entirely, an individual gains a level of autonomy that appears almost impossible to manipulate or predict. Emotional mastery begins with awareness. Before control is possible, the mind must recognize the onset of feelings, irritation, excitement, fear, or desire. This recognition is often subtle, as emotions emerge gradually and influence thought before full awareness. A strong mind cultivates sensitivity to these shifts, noticing even micro-level changes in energy, heart rate, or mental focus. Awareness allows for deliberate response rather than automatic reaction, which is the foundation of influence over one's own emotional state. Once awareness is established, regulation becomes possible. Regulation does not mean denying or ignoring feelings. Instead, it involves observing the emotion, understanding its origin, and deciding how to respond. For example, anger may signal boundary violation, fear may highlight risk, and excitement may indicate opportunity. A strong mind decodes the message of emotion without letting it dictate immediate action. This separation between stimulus and response is often invisible, but has a profound psychological impact on observers. One of the most striking effects of emotional mastery is the creation of composure in unpredictable situations. Most people react visibly under pressure, revealing frustration, impatience, or anxiety. These reactions provide others with leverage, influence, or insight into internal state. A mind trained in emotional control responds with measured calm, even in high-stress circumstances. This calmness is unsettling to observers because it disrupts their expectations of predictable emotional feedback and conveys an unshakable presence. Emotional mastery also enhances decision-making. When the mind is not hijacked by reactive impulses, it can process information rationally and strategically. Risk assessment, problem-solving, and planning are more precise because the influence of fear, excitement, or frustration is minimized. Observers often interpret this clarity and decisiveness as strength or even intimidation because it contrasts sharply with the reactive behavior around them. Self-regulation is another crucial aspect. Emotional mastery allows the individual to choose which situations warrant expression, reaction, or engagement. Not every trigger requires response, and not every opinion requires articulation. By filtering responses consciously, the mind preserves energy, maintains focus, and avoids unnecessary conflict. This selective engagement also enhances the perception of authority because others notice the controlled and deliberate nature of behavior. Emotional mastery strengthens resilience. Life is inherently unpredictable, and setbacks, criticism, and failure are unavoidable. When the mind is not dependent on transient emotional highs or lows, these events are processed objectively. Failure becomes feedback, criticism becomes data, and setbacks become temporary rather than defining. This resilience is subtle but profoundly affects how others perceive the individual's stability, reliability, and strength. The practice of mastering emotion also fosters empathy without loss of composure. By understanding one's own emotional processes, the mind becomes more capable of reading and interpreting the emotional cues of others. This insight allows for strategic communication, conflict resolution, and influence while maintaining internal stability. Empathy is thus leveraged intelligently rather than reactively, increasing psychological presence without diminishing autonomy. Another aspect of emotional mastery is patience. Strong minds understand that not all outcomes or resolutions are immediate. Emotional impulses often demand instant gratification, immediate response, or quick resolution, but mastery allows the mind to delay reaction and act at optimal moments. Patience enhances strategy, reinforces control, and makes actions more effective, which in turn can unsettle those who rely on predictable timing or reactive engagement. Emotional control also reduces susceptibility to manipulation. People often attempt to influence others through guilt, flattery, fear, or provocation. When the mind is detached from immediate emotional response, these tactics lose effectiveness. The individual becomes less readable, less reactive, and less influenced by external pressures. This invisibly shifts power dynamics in subtle but unmistakable ways, creating presence and authority without overt assertion. Practicing emotional mastery also changes self-perception. Confidence increases as the mind learns that internal state is not dictated by circumstances, people, or outcomes. This internal confidence radiates outward, altering social perception. Others may sense that the individual is unshakable, unmanipulable, and self-contained, which can evoke admiration, respect, or even subtle intimidation. Emotionally masterful minds also foster clearer communication. Without the interference of reactive emotion, words are chosen deliberately, tone is measured, and intentions are precise. Communication becomes a tool rather than an outlet, shaping perception, guiding interaction, and reinforcing internal control. Observers perceive this clarity as authority because it signals awareness, competence, and composure. Another critical component is the integration of emotion with logic. Mastery does not eliminate feeling, but channels it. Passion can be harnessed for motivation, focus, and creativity. Frustration can be converted into problem-solving energy. Fear can inform caution without paralyzing action. The mind's ability to integrate emotion strategically increases effectiveness in both personal and professional domains, while maintaining psychological independence from external influence. Emotional mastery also affects long-term resilience and mental health. By regulating emotional responses, the mind reduces stress, avoids overreaction, and minimizes impulsive behavior that could lead to regret. This self-management contributes to sustainable energy, focus, and strategic action, enabling a level of consistency and control that others perceive as strength. Finally, the mastery of emotion cultivates presence. When internal states are steady, reactions measured, and responses deliberate, the individual naturally commands attention. Others sense an inner authority that is not forced but emanates from self-regulation, understanding, and clarity. This presence is both calming and intimidating because it contrasts sharply with the reactive, emotionally driven behavior that dominates most social and professional interactions. At close, the journey to a mind so strong it unsettles others is not about aggression, dominance, or forcing control. It is about mastering yourself, your thoughts, emotions, focus, and presence, so that your energy, decisions, and actions are guided by clarity rather than reaction. Each principle, detaching from validation, cultivating discipline, conserving mental energy, practicing observation, building emotional mastery, and embracing solitude, forms a layer of inner strength that is subtle but unmistakable. The combination of these habits creates a psychological presence that naturally commands respect, inspires awe, and influences without effort. Strength of mind is quiet, consistent, and invisible in its process, yet profoundly felt by those around you. It is the kind of power that does not need to announce itself, because it shows through composure, wisdom, and deliberate action. This mind is not forged overnight. It grows through repeated practice, reflection, and self-alignment. Each time you resist the urge to over-explain, each time you choose principle over approval, each time you observe instead of reacting, you add another brick to the foundation of mental resilience. Over time, these small, deliberate acts accumulate into a presence that is calm yet commanding, quiet yet influential. The stronger your internal framework becomes, the less the world can sway you, and the more your mind becomes an unshakable force in every environment you enter. Ultimately, building a mind that others notice, respect, or even fear is not about trying to intimidate. It is about refusing to be manipulated, refusing to be controlled, and refusing to live unconsciously. It is about creating a life where every thought, decision, and action aligns with your internal standards, and where your mental strength is not contingent on circumstances, outcomes, or opinions. This is a mind that is free, focused, and unassailable. A mind that commands attention without effort, influences without words, and moves through the world with quiet authority.